you. Well, first of all, a cordial thanks to Dean Antonio Lopez for the invitation to speak today. And I would have thanked Vice President Anderson and Provost Schindler if they had been here. And of course, a thanks to all of you, especially the class of 2005. Hello to all those whom I haven't been able to greet yet. That was that was great. Thank you for that. Very helpfully laying out some problems with the human rights enterprise and also giving one of the most compelling accounts I've ever heard for why we shouldn't just chuck it. Thank you for that. I think I'm seeing the same problem or a similar problem, coming at it a bit differently. I'm not a jurist, and I actually don't know much about the subject of rights, either historically or sort of contemporary rights theory. So I'm just really trying to think through certain phenomena that, in my judgment, are more or less available to the man in the street. The title of my talk is Bonum mihi non est sine te, which is a quote from Psalm 16. Nothing's good for me without you. Thoughts on the problem of human rights. So a question, is Dignitatis humanae's willingness to speak the language of human rights a capitulation to modernity or a capitulation to the human rights enterprise? A handful of statements read out of context might seem to justify an affirmative answer to that question. But on a deeper reading, it turns out, and this is, I think, Professor Schindler was going to show this pretty conclusively, if the Council Fathers approved the apprehension of dignitas humana that's expressed, however inadequately, in the notion of rights, they also sought to reclaim that apprehension for Catholic truth. And that reclamation is a complex and rich act. Professor Healy indicated some of that complexity and richness yesterday. It's as if Dignitatis Humanae were inviting the Church to heal the notion of human rights from the inside, to liberate it, as it were, into its truth through an act of substitutionary confession. The Conciliar Declaration on Religious Liberty on this reading would thus enact the Church's mission to be the admirabile commercium, the wondrous exchange between divine purity and human and sinful man, as that exchange is extended through history. Or as the Colombian philosopher Nicolas Gómez Dávila puts it, the Church is the sewer of history, the tumultuous flowing of human impurity towards immaculate seas. Actually, I think that's actually one of the most, it's one of the funniest, of course, but it's also one of the most beautiful and actually precise definitions of the Church, insofar as you can define the Church, that I've ever come across. Now, if this brief account of Dignitatis Humanae is correct, then it's no betrayal of the document's fundamental intention to suggest, as I'm going to do in the first quarter of my presentation, there's 4 quarters but no halftime, so it's like and unlike football.
Do you play that here at CUA?
I'm actually a neutral party in this case. Anyway, so it's no betrayal then of the document's fundamental intention to suggest, as I'm going to do in this first quarter, that there's something wrong with rights, at least when they're understood in sort of classical American fashion. And this is just one of the phenomena. I'm not claiming to sort of have studied all of the documents, but I just think as a phenomenon, when they're understood in sort of what I would call classical American fashion to be inalienable possessions of the individual, inalienable rights, whose title to own them, the individual's title to own them, precedes and limits the claims of society. So what's wrong with, or what's the problem, would be a better way of asking the question, what's the problem that's raised by that notion of inalienable rights? Again, I think we Americans sort of unreflectively tend to think of rights as powers that an individual may use or refrain from using according to the dictates of his conscience. And we could add that those powers are generally powers to have a desire fulfilled or the pursuit of a desire not hindered. And to claim that those powers are inalienable is in a way to seek, an absolutely incontestable title to their ownership. A title that one's fellow men and society are sort of obliged to recognize a priori and across the board, just as a condition of our social coexistence. Now, obviously, this claim is attractive. It's very attractive because it seems to give the individual a means to underscore and protect his dignity as a subject, both before himself and others. And we know that many people have not only marched in the cause, marched and suffered and died for just causes under the banner of rights, as Professor Carrozza was saying. But there's also, as I say, a difficulty, a problem that's raised, because it seems that the assertion of absolute ownership of a power to use or refrain, especially when what's used or refrained from is a sort of a desire or even an appetite, that it seems that the assertion of absolute ownership to a power in that sense, however limited that ownership may be in other respects, almost inevitably expresses and even generates a desire to possess our very selves, not just ourselves, but our very selves, outside of participation in the common good. Well, why is that a problem? It's a problem because no matter how justified it may be to protect ourselves in any given case, and of course there are cases where we have to do that, and and there are even cases when it might even be sinful not to. Nevertheless, the attempt to grasp our very selves sort of systematically, apart from sharing in a bonum commune, is actually to lose them. In the natural order of things, there is no man, no human self, and no human dignity outside of some kind of communion in the common good. There simply is no such thing, really, as a pre-social or asocial human being. No sociality, no humanity, and therefore no human dignity either. So what I've been calling the problem of rights, and I want to formulate this carefully to take account of the sort of sensitivity, the beautiful sensitivity that Professor Carrozza expressed in his talk, let's say as a temptation. Temptation is not something you have to succumb to. It may be something that you generally do, but it's not something that you have to succumb to. But the point about this temptation is that it arises in the very act of claiming inalienable possession of rights. Fundamentally, the temptation, as you can sort of hear this in the background of what I'm saying, is the temptation that places us before the same question that Adam and Eve faced in the garden, and of course answered badly. And in a way, there's a certain sense in which even having the question was already a beginning of the problem, but then that raises further questions about the significance of human fallibility, which I want to come back to at the end of the talk. And the question is this, it's very simple. Do you want to try to be something, a self, outside of communion or inside of communion? And that means Are you going to rejoice in your being as a gift and so possess it by returning it to the giver? I'm introducing the giver here, but of course, behind the communion and expressed in the communion among us is always the giver. Or are you going to refuse this return and so treat your being not as a gift, but as an elusive possession that slips through your fingers at the very moment when you think you've closed them tightly around your quarry? So there's this temptation that's just there. And in light of that temptation, we could say that this Dignitatis Humanae's program, or at least the program that I'm ascribing to it, of healing the notion of human rights in the spirit of substitutionary confession, requires a lot of things, but one thing it requires would be rethinking human dignity. So not losing sight of that intuition that there is human dignity, the dignity of the person, as we often say, but rethinking that dignity within man's natural communion in the human, in some common good. No task is more painful and more beautiful. I mean, we all know this. I mean, anybody who grew up in or is busy founding a family, but anyone who participates in the church knows that no task is more painful and more beautiful, more urgent and more joyful than the task of learning or relearning to say to God and to one another what David says in Psalm 16, Bonum mihi non est sine te, which I'm going to translate slightly questionably as nothing is good for me without you. Nothing's good for me without you. Now, at this point, I want to turn to St. Augustine, who is, I think, often unfairly maligned in our sort of John Paul II circles, as if he were a kind of a foil for John Paul II, rather than, let's say, a master and a precursor. St. Augustine opens his treatise on the good of marriage, De Bono Coniugali, which is a beautiful text. It's strangely beautiful because it's on the surface runs so counter to so many of our assumptions about marriage and family and so forth. But if you dig deeply, it's just phenomenal and beautiful, phenomenally beautiful. But he opens his treatise with an affirmation of man's inescapably social nature. And it's the implications of that social nature for human dignity that I want to ponder in this second quarter. We're already in the second quarter. Halftime means no rest, but it also means no Beyonce, so that's not a bad thing. Who in a way is always singing about, nothing's good for me without you, baby, right? I mean, So actually, I have to reconsider that. Anyway, he says this in the very first line of the text, and first lines of texts of this caliber, if that's the right word for this, something like this, are always very significant. And he says, unus quisque homo humani generis pars est, et sociale quidam est humana natura, magnumque habet et naturale bonum vimquoque amicitiae, which means, more or less, every single man is a part of mankind, and human nature is a social kind of thing, and has a great and natural good and a force of friendship as well. In these 20 words, Augustine condenses what I think is an inexhaustibly rich contemplation of mankind in its concrete unity, as a sociale quidam, as in a way, a single socially existing entity, kind of like the church. This insight, this contemplation, which includes insight, implies, among other things, that human nature is not only ordered to the common good. Everybody who thinks within our tradition knows that. But partly thanks to the paper that David Christopher Schindler, D.C. Schindler, gave a few years back about the common good. I've been thinking, and I think it's in Augustine, that human nature itself, in a way, is a common good, and that the vis, the lively force of its very being, is amicitia, is friendship. So human nature is a common good, always subsisting by its inmost vital force in some communion of persons. Now, Augustine's insight into man's nature as personally shared communal, as a personally shared common good, overcomes. And when I say overcomes, I mean shows how we don't have to oppose, even though, of course, we often do, what? The priority of the common good and the dignity of the person, which are often taken to be incompatible principles. And however difficult it may be to do justice to both principles in practice, justice itself, which in the end is our only guide to this practice, and in a way that's sort of how I would answer the question, what would we do if we did jettison the tradition of rights, which I'm not suggesting actually that we do, but quite. But that's what I would say, is that it has to guide that practice. And this justice itself exists only in the interplay of the common good and the dignity of the human person. Justice presupposes society in a way, and in a certain sense. I mean, we would have to qualify that so as not to run into obvious totalitarian temptations, but in a way it presupposes society, and society is something that's both a substantive common good and the communion of persons who are together sharing it. It's both things. So if human nature is itself a bonum commune, subsisting in interpersonal communion, always in some form, then the objectivity we associate with the idea of a substantive common good isn't really, I mean, in principle, a threat to human dignity or individual dignity, as the American belief in inalienable rights would incline us to believe. Actually, it's the very medium of its constitution and expression in the first place. The dignity of the individual consists not in possessive self-protection from the common good. That's how you lose yourself. If you make that your sort of basic modus operandi, rather than acknowledging that in certain cases you do need to defend yourself, but also in the name of the common good that you share. So individual dignity consists not in possessive self-protection from the common good, but in personal representation of it for and with your fellows. Personhood is representation, and I just want to say a little bit about what I mean by that. I know I'm moving very quickly and throwing a lot of things together. Unfortunately, that's how my mind works, or doesn't, as you might care to. You're right to decide which. So we can fruitfully compare the common good to the topic of conversation that you propose to introduce at a dinner party that you're going to be hosting for your friends. If you're a good host, you'll choose a topic that's intrinsically worth talking about, because you know that only such a topic can involve everyone at his best. Such a question is a common good in the truest sense, because at one and the same time, and in virtue of one and the same principle, it enables both the personal enrichment of each and the interpersonal communion of all. And this simultaneity illustrates what it means to represent the common good for and with one's fellows. Again, returning to the notion, the image of the dinner table conversation, the intrinsic merit of the evening's topic of conversation, I was saying, gives each dinner guest a share in it, or at least a chance to share in it if they're doing their part. Each table fellow, therefore, enjoys an access to the theme that's under discussion that is both immediate, the access is both immediate. Each of us can sort of see the topic objectively, which means from the point of view of the topic, from the point of view of what's good for the topic, what needs to be said to discuss the topic properly. And the access is also mediated because each one of us can see it from the topic from another's point of view, which he knows is different and at the same time similar to his own. It's analogous to his own. So the anonymously objective and the intersubjective, if you want to throw those terms around, or the natural and the personal, that's what I'm trying to illustrate, are two sides of the same coin, or rather, two distinct but interpenetrating dimensions of the same bonum commune. Now, within this context, each dinner guest has a certain authority to speak, or to be silent, which he is granted to exercise in the name of the topic, as it were, and therefore, by extension, in the name of the conversation that's surrounding it. Insofar as each guest has an immediate share in the topic, he can identify himself with it, as it were. He can look, so to speak, with it from its point of view towards his table fellows. And so he can represent it vis-a-vis them. He can put a face to it. He can be its face for them. Insofar as his share in the topic is mediated, however, this posture vis-a-vis his fellow diners takes account of, and it presupposes, their capacity to adopt it back to him, with respect to him. In this sense, to represent the common good personally for others, that's the vis-a-vis aspect, is always to represent it interpersonally with them. And you can see how the two dimensions are one when a person, by his discreet and encouraging presence, allows others to engage the topic. There you have the sort of common good of the conversation being manifested in a with, right? Two people are with each other and are speaking to each other, and therefore are with each other, and you're guaranteeing that with by your discrete presence. And so you're summing up, as it were, the unity of the personal and the common, the anonymous and the subjective in the common good. That example, it's just an image, right, suggests that the dignity of the person is not threatened by the bonum commune, by the common good, but coincides with the capacity to represent it, even when you do so in the role of a silent and perhaps unconscious third who guarantees the with structure of the thing. But the dinner party example also suggests how the mutual inclusion of the person and the common good shapes the form of justice. That was the point I mentioned a little bit back, because to do justice is to render the other his due, insofar as he's a fellow partaker in and joint representative of the common good. To have the right to make claims, if you want to put it in that language, depends on duties, it's correlative with duties, and both are expressions of some office of representation within the play of the common good. And so if we returned to, or if we attempt to integrate the dignity of the common good, the priority of the common good and the dignity of the person, and want to hold on to some notion of rights, the rights would have to express justice in that sense, rendering each one his due and asking to have one's due rendered in return. In virtue of what? Not in virtue of some inalienable power that exists prior to society. In a certain sense, that's already exists. That's what it means to be born, is to be a fellow subject within a communion. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit lost here because I have to confess I woke up at 2:30 this morning, and realized that I needed to rewrite the whole thing. So I'm just a little bit frazzled. I needed to do some healing from within. But anyway, so if we kept rights in that sense, the definition and exercise of them would have to become much suppler than they are now, because they would have to be combined with, correlated with duties, and both rights and duties would have to be correlative and appropriate to some concrete form of representation, some office, as it were, within the play of the common good. Does this communalization of rights, does this relativization of absolute inalienability deny the transcendence of personal dignity? That would be the question that would be thrown back at me, and I would just ask a counter question. Which embodies the imago Dei, because in the end, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the transcendence of the person, right? I have to say I don't like the word transcendence because it can sort of mean anything. Like religion, transcendence is good, religion is good. Well, which religion is it and which transcendence is it? So the counter question would be, which embodies the imago Dei more faithfully? A power to claim that's divorced from love because it's made systematically safe from communion, a kind of injustice insurance that's supposed to be, that's underwritten by the state, and that is an infallible guarantee that nothing bad is ever going to happen to me. Because that's the implication of this. And the point is, there really is no infallible guarantee against injustice. That's the point. I mean, if you want history, I was being scolded yesterday for my ahistorical proclivities, but as a matter of fact, it's actually ahistorical. It's a denial of divine providence to think that we can erect an infallible guarantee that nothing bad is ever going to happen to us, and that's what is going on here. Not on the level of conscious intention and so forth, but I mean, if you isolate the claim and sort of analyze it on its own merits, that's where it leads. So, is that what most faithfully embodies the imago Dei, or would it be a power to claim? So we're not giving that up. We're not giving up the power to make claims, but a power that's one with love because it's formed within communion. I mean, the alternative is very simple. And however frightening it might be to relinquish the ideal of an infallible a priori injustice insurance that can never be removed from the pockets of the abstract individual, right? I mean, he's born naked into the world with pockets, and in those pockets is injustice insurance, right? A lifetime policy, right? That's of course that's frightening, right? And I feel that whenever I think about, okay, do we give up the rights tradition, that fear comes immediately to the surface, obviously. But it's significantly riskier, and I'm tempted to say it's infinitely riskier it's significantly less risky, and it's infinitely, and almost infinitely so, than contradicting or destroying ourselves by clinging to the idea that we can have it, and therefore that we can be a self outside of communion. It just doesn't work, period. So in other words, we're not talking about, we have to go back to an older doctrine because, no, what we're saying is that this older doctrine isn't just a theory among many, but it's actually explaining what it means to be a human being, such that the human being either is that or he's not a human being. And the point I've been trying to make is that rightly understood and deepened, that older doctrine actually makes all the room in the world for personal dignity. Okay, this leads me to the third quarter of my presentation. And here I want to show how contraception, and it's obvious why I'm bringing that up, right? Because we're dealing with the HHS mandate. How contraception symbolizes the problem with inalienable rights, as they are typically understood in America. Let's return for a moment to the thesis that human nature is a common good, always subsisting in some communion of persons. If we consider that both familial society and political society are forms of this communion, we can glimpse an analogy between the family and the city. By calling these two forms of communion analogous, I'm not saying that they look alike. I'm saying that they both do the same thing in different ways, even though the ways are interrelated. And what's that same thing? Well, it's realizing the common good of human nature in their respective type of communio personarum. And this analogy implies not just a comparability between two sort of patterns or relations, but it implies an interplay, a circumcision, if you will. And the natural form of that circumcision can remain intact only under certain conditions. And one of those conditions is that the city has to reverence the natural shape of the family. If, in fact, the city tramples on the very context in which man first displays his nature as a social thing, as a sociale quidam, how can it remain faithful to its own way of maintaining man's social nature? How can the city then avoid violating its own good as a natural form of human community? And that's what we're facing today in the HHS mandate, or thanks to the HHS mandate. Augustine exhibits the natural form of the family that I've just alluded to in the second sentence of De Bono Coniugali, where he goes on to say that the society of husband and wife, that is marriage, is the first manifestation of this natural society. He says, prima itaque naturalis humanae societatis copula vir et uxor est. So, therefore, the first coupling of human society is husband and wife. And he's not proposing the familiar and somewhat misleading idea that marriage or the family is the elementary building block of society. Rather, he's saying that marriage is the original self-expression of man, homo, as a social kind of thing. Marriage is a metaphysically saturated, real symbol of man's being as love, as sociality. Now, Augustine devotes a lot of De Bono Coniugali, and this is the part that bothers modern readers, I would think, to pondering how the sexual act can faithfully prolong this symbolism. In this context, he explains that concubitus, you hear the con, with, lying with each other, the lying with each other, the sleeping together of husband and wife becomes a properly nuptial act, and he uses that terminology. How does the sexual act, concubitus, become a properly nuptial or conjugal act? That's what he asks. He says it can become properly nuptial, a conjugal act in the true sense, and Dr. Crawford can explain what that means. No, I mean seriously. I think you have to, if you want to understand that, you have to talk with him. Only if it occurs on account of procreation, causa generandi, he says. Nowadays, sort of after Humanae Vitae and John Paul II, we would say that each sexual act has to be open to new life. We could debate about whether Augustine would sort of endorse that formulation and so forth, but the point, I think the essential point remains unchanged, which is that concubitus, lying together, the being together as the one flesh union, has to have an appropriate, commensurate, common good that reflects its nature as a one flesh union of two embodied persons. But what common good could be more appropriate and commensurate to this union than a third embodied person who personally represents the personal with structure, communion structure, that determines the very natural form of concubitus in the first place. This is why Augustine can call the child both the connection of conjugal society, connexio, and its one honest fruit, bond and fruit. It's actually very Balthasarian, if you will. These giants are not, even when they're wrestling with each other, they're all very much in the same boxing ring or wrestling ring. I'm sorry, I know I'm going. Do I have a little bit more time just to finish this? Gosh, I don't know how, because the last time I did this, I was able to do the whole thing. Look, I'm just going to read through this. I can do it in 5 minutes.
You started late. So.
Forgive me for this. I feel like I need to say this. So anyway, that's why I got up at 2:30 this morning, involuntarily. So, the connection and the fruit, by which Augustine means the child is the embodied representation of the with, in which the common good of human nature manifests itself in and as fruitful personal communion. Okay. Augustine's account of what a much later theology would call the inseparability of the unitive and the procreative implies that the conjugal act is an inherently social good. The marital embrace, the saint is telling us, is a representation of marital society, which in turn is a representation of human nature as a sociale quidam, that is, as a common good subsisting always in some communion of persons. Indeed, in the bridal chamber, husband and wife are, with the R of representation, that very communion, that very interpersonally subsisting common good, precisely because they share both themselves and their very sharing through the mediation of the child, who, as I keep saying, is the embodiment of their with at the juncture between nature and person. Augustine also insists in the treatise that virginity is an even higher and so more desirable good than marriage. That's a hard teaching for a lot of people, but it should be said. It's still, in some sense, the teaching of the church. But that insistence, and here is a point that Dr. Crawford is also very helpful on, that insistence doesn't mean that the conjugal act or marriage is no good. Rather, that insistence helps us see, at least with the distance of these intervening centuries, that the intrinsic aptitude for generation is a call to an analogously virginal attitude of having as if you didn't have. Well, having what? Having the gift of being, and having the very giving of that gift. Because the possession of that gift becomes especially intense precisely in the ecstasy of the marital embrace, in which husband and wife find themselves by losing themselves to each other and into the giving of new life as representatives of nature and, dare I say it, of nature's God. The real one, though. The conjugal act is a liturgy of representation in which enjoyment and kenosis, self-possession and self-sacrifice, are one in a gesture analogous to the Eucharistic self-offering of consecrated virginity. I'm not married, but I imagine that people do experience that occasionally. This brief Augustinian reflection on the nature of the conjugal act as a social good all the way down suggests the sense in which contraception reaches into the core of the problem of inalienable rights. The gesture of contraception, in fact, not only contradicts the virginal form of the conjugal act. By doing so, it reproduces the form, another form, of the temptation to which the assertion of inalienable rights is structurally prone. The attempt to possess oneself outside of joint participation in the common good is that temptation, and both succumb to it. And so it's not a wonder, it's not astonishing that a state that's committed to the protection of inalienable rights is also committed, eventually, if you remove all of the restraining obstacles, to remaking human society in the image of man as autonomous chooser, and then that man as autonomous chooser is so autonomous is that he tries to lay hold of the very nature, not only of the conjugal act, but of man himself as a social thing, and remake it from the inside out. Contraceptive control of the one natural act in which a human society can generate new members is a necessary symbol, almost, of the image of man as autonomous chooser, who as such must be free to redefine even his own nature as a personally subsisting common good. Okay, 2 more paragraphs and I'm done. So this brings me to the last quarter, which is also the shortest. If the claim of inalienable rights is prone to a temptation whose real symbol is contraception, and that eventually is going to get forced down the throat of the church, then what are we to say about man's inalienable right to religious liberty? I've already suggested the need to rethink inalienability inside of communion rather than outside of it. I don't know what it would mean when you put it back in. That would be something that we would have to discuss, but I think we need to do that on peril of extinction, actually. But what about religious liberty itself? Is it a bad idea that we must finally reject now that it is revealing its ugliest consequences? I have to confess I'm really tempted to that view sometimes. I'm kind of a closet traditionalist on certain things. But I'd like to suggest that however tempting an affirmative answer may sometimes be, a more Catholic response is to continue the deepening of the notion of religious liberty to which this conference is devoted. And so let me end with just a final word about one direction that deepening might take, and that brings us back to Gomez Davila's image of the church as the sewer of history. If we are to rediscover religious freedom, as the motto of the conference enjoins upon us to do, in the spirit of Dignitatis humanae, we need to relearn to see the entire question as a whole. So we need to be really philosophical. And then we also, sort of inside of that, need to see it in a theological light. In particular, we need to rethink the right to religious freedom in light of the providential significance of human fallibility. A significance that the political authority, as a minister of divine providence, always has to keep in mind. And that would be something, that would be a basis, perhaps even a traditional basis, for something like a right to religious freedom. In performing this task, the church needs an eidos. It needs a concretely embodied ideal, a historically embodied ideal, which is really what ideals always are. And that concretely embodied ideal is in a way the family, and it's in a way the natural common good of political society, but it's also the church, because the church sacramentally mediates the eschatological fulfillment of both societies and of their interplay. Let me emphasize what I just said: concretely embodied, historically embodied. Well, where? Well, I said in the church, but what is the church? Well, it's that sewer. I mean, and that's actually really rooted in something like John's gospel, right? Jesus kneels down and washes the feet of his apostles, and he's God, right? So in that sewer, in which the whole of human history, in all its ambiguity, Bill and Glenn, is assumed, is taken up without either moralistic indignation or connivance, because God knows neither of those things, is taken up, is helped to purify itself through confession, and thus is given a new chance to be fruitful beyond its deepest hope. In that sense, you could think of religious freedom as something much more than the object of an individual right. You could think of it as the church itself. The church is religious freedom in the spirit of substitutionary confession for all and on behalf of all. Thank you. Sorry.